What's going on, everybody? Thanks for tuning back in. Today we're going to be taking a look at how to use JSON Web Tokens as your authentication of choice for a RESTful API. For our RESTful API base, we're going to be using NodeJS, Typescript, and Express, and we're going to be storing our username and password into either a MongoDB or a MySQL database. This video is actually going to be split into two videos. The first half of each video is going to be the same, where I set up the common functions between both MySQL and Mongoose, and then the second half of the video is going to be specific for MySQL or Mongoose, respectively. If you do not have a RESTful API to begin with, I do have a GitHub repository that does have this project set up as a base for you, so I will leave those links below in the description, and you could follow along with the code, or you could start with your own. It should be very easy to actually integrate whatever I'm doing into your API if you have it set up in a similar way. Okay guys, let's get into it. So to get started, let's run an npm install bcrypt.js and JSON Web Token. And after we do that, we're going to do the same thing with the type definitions by doing an npm install --save dev and then the types for each, as you'll see in a moment. What these libraries do is JSON Web Token has all of the built-in functions we need to create a token for each specific user, and bcrypt.js is going to help us encrypt our password before we put it in the database. It's important that we don't store your password as plain text in the database for security reasons. The next thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to be renaming some files that I have from my API setup from that GitHub repository I told you about before, and I'm going to create some folders. I'm going to create a functions folder, a middleware folder, and I'm also going to be creating an interfaces folder. I'm going to rename my routes sample TS to my user TS. I'm going to do the same thing for my controller. Inside my server file, I'm going to rename this to my user routes and then change my user routes down below, as well as my API path. Again, the reason that I'm doing all this is because I'm using a previously set up tutorial GitHub repository that I made before. So again, if you're following along with your own project, you don't have to take these steps. I'm going to go inside my controller function and I'm going to rename this first function to validate token. I'm just going to get rid of everything on the inside here, and I'm going to copy this 4 times because I'm going to need 4 different routes for this specific tutorial. The 4 routes that I'm going to need are validate token. I'm going to need a register route. I'm going to need a login route, and I'm going to need a get all users route. I'm also at the top of the file going to throw in a constant namespace so I can keep track of my logging and where my logging comes from. So to briefly explain what we're going to need these functions for, validate token is going to be a protected route that we're going to use for testing to make sure that the token we assign ourselves in our login function is working properly and the user is authenticated properly. The register route is going to be for creating a new user and storing them in the database. The login route is going to log in the user and return that token and maybe the user object as well. And then the get all users is just a standard extra function that I'm going to throw in where it is just going to return each user in the database and not show their passwords. So let's start by filling out each of the functions and files that we can before we have to pick our MySQL or Mongo database. Let's start off in the validate token by adding a little logging statement here. My logging library uses a namespace. That's why I'm having this constant at the top. I'm going to pass in my namespace, and I'm going to pass in a message that says token validated, user authorized. You could put really anything you want here. And then I'm going to return a response with the status of 200 with a JSON message on the inside that simply says the user is authorized. At the bottom in the export default statement, I'm going to go ahead and pass in my 4 functions. You don't have to name them, as when you just put in the name, JavaScript understands that you're passing in both the key and the value as the exact same thing. Inside the register function, I'm going to go ahead and put a let brackets equal to my request.body. And on the inside, I'm going to pass in a username and password. At the top of the file, I'm going to import bcrypt.js from bcrypt.js. And then back inside my register file, I'm going to actually run the bcrypt.js.hash function. Inside of it, I'm going to be passing in a couple things here. First, I'm going to pass in the password, which is the password coming from our request.body, so it's not encrypted yet. Then I'm going to pass in a number that it needs for the length of the salt. And the last but not least, I'm going to pass in a callback function with an error and a hash. So as far as how bcrypt.js actually works, I suggest you read the documentation, as I'm not an expert on salting and hashing, but I do know how to use the library to encrypt my passwords. Inside of the bcrypt hash function, first I'm going to check to see if there is an error. So I'm going to check to see if there is a hash error, and if so, I'm going to return a response.status of 500. I'm going to send back some JSON with both the message and the error. So the message I can get from the hash error.message, and the error is going to be from my hash error itself. And then after that if statement, I'm just going to put in a little comment here that says insert user into DB. So depending on if we're using Mongo or MySQL here, this is where we're going to actually insert the user. Next, I'm going to go to my routes, and first I'm going to enter my validate route and attach it to the appropriate controller validate token. I'm going to copy and paste this 4 times. And then I'm just going to rename my routes for each of my functions. So I'm going to have a register, a login, and a get /all for get all users. I'm going to change the 2 in the middle, register and login, to post requests because I'm going to be passing in information. And then after I'm done this, I'm going to change each of the controller's functions to the appropriate one. So register, login, and get all users. Once I'm done all this, I'm going to create a new interface. So this is how I'm going to keep track of my data type and what's supposed to be on my data type when I'm grabbing it from the database or inserting it in the database. So we're going to create a new interface called user.ts. On the inside, we're going to do an export default interface iUser. And on the inside, we're going to have 2 keys, a username and password with the values of string correspondingly. Nice and simple. In our middleware, let's go ahead and create an extract JWT.ts function. So this is the first function we're actually going to take a look at working with tokens. So to explain how the tokens work, basically what happens is you request a token from the server and the server signs it for you. Now, every time you make a request to a protected route in the server, you're going to have to pass along that token inside your authorization header on your post request, which I'm going to show you how to do later in Postmon. What this middleware is going to be doing, it's actually going to be taking out that token and checking to see if it's valid. So if this function determines that, yes, your token is valid, it will proceed and let you to the root. Otherwise, you're going to get a 401 unauthorized error. So we're going to go ahead and import some brackets from Express. And inside of that, we're going to be returning its request, response, and next function interfaces appropriately. And I'm actually going to just go ahead and I'm just going to copy one of my functions from my controller because it already has it kind of set up for me. And I'm going to paste it in this file. I'm just going to close the function off. And instead of validate token, I'm going to rename this to extract JWT because it's going to work much like those functions do. Except in this one, we're actually going to be using the next to pass along to the next function inside of the request. I'm going to put a little logging statement in here, just saying validating token. Now to extract the token from my headers, I'm going to check my headers for my request from the authorization. And what I'm doing is I'm actually splitting the array by the space and grabbing the second part. When you pass in your token, you're going to be passing in what's called a bearer token. So it's literally going to have the word bearer in front with a space and then the token. The reason that we're doing this is because this is one of the standards that a lot of APIs use, and it's good coding practice. So let's go ahead and check if there is a token. Inside of this is where we're going to be actually using our JWT functions. So let's import JWT from JSON Web Token. And inside of our config, before we do anything else, I have to add a couple things here. We have to add an issuer, the expire time, and a secret that's going to actually encrypt the token. So inside of my config file, I'm going to go ahead and make 3 new variables like you see here. And I'm going to call them server underscore token underscore expire time. I'm going to do server underscore token underscore issuer. And I'm going to be doing a server underscore token underscore secret. And again, the secret is for actually encrypting and decrypting your JWT. The issuer, you can basically just use this as your organization name. This is just a little bit extra to put inside the token. And then the expire time is the expire time in seconds. Once we've created our 3 variables, let's go ahead and put that into our server object just below it. And then everything inside the config file is all gravy. So now, if we go back to our extract JWT function, let's go ahead and call JWT.verify. And inside of it, we're going to pass in the token. We're going to pass in our config.server.token.secret. And config should automatically import for you with Visual Studio Code if you don't have it already. And then a callback with error and decoded. So if there is an error, you have a few options here. You can return a 401 unauthorized, or you can return something else like a 404 or a 500. The reason that you would do this is because maybe you have a very, very secure API and you don't actually want end users knowing why their token didn't work. In that case, you could use a 404 or a 500 if you want to be extra sneaky about it. So let's go ahead and just return a response.status of 404. Much like we do in the catch error blocks of the other functions, and just pass in our message, error.message, and our error object. Once we get past this, we can go ahead and just put else, and we can actually pass along our decoded to our endpoint. And how we can do that is by using the response.locals. Response.locals is a clever way to go ahead and save variables and pass them along to the functions or middleware that are going to be using this payload next. So after I add my JWT decoded, I can go ahead and just call the next function right after it. So what it's going to do is going to save my token decoded, and it's going to go ahead and pass that along. At the bottom, we can just put an else, and here if you want, you can return a 401 unauthorized. At the bottom, we can go ahead and export default extract JWT. Now we can go ahead and create a new function called sign JWT. So when our user logs in, we're going to be calling this sign JWT. That's actually going to create the token and return it to them so that they can use it to try and access any of our protected routes with that extract JWT function. At the top, we're going to import JWT from JSON Web Token. We're going to import our config from our config file. We're going to import our logging from our logging file. And we're going to import our iUser from our interfaces user. We're going to add our namespace of auth. And we're going to create our sign JWT function. Now, this function is going to have two parameters, a user of type iUser and a callback. Inside the callback, we're going to have an error that's either equal to an error or null. Or it's going to have our token, which is going to be a string or null. So inside of this, we're going to need to start off with three variables. Our first variable is going to be our time since epoch, which is going to be a new date.getTime. This is going to return the time in milliseconds since I think it's like January 1st, 1970. This is like the basic millisecond date for all of your date objects. So next, actually, we're going to be doing our expire time, which is going to be our time since epoch plus the number that we have in our config, which is actually the time in minutes, not seconds. And we're going to be multiplying that by 100,000 to get the time in milliseconds. Then we're going to be creating another var, our expiration time in seconds. And how we get that is using a math.floor and then dividing your expire time by 1,000. After that, we're going to be adding some logging. So I'm just going to say attempting to sign the token for user.username here. And then we're going to be adding a try catch block. Inside of it, we're going to be doing a JWT.sign. Now, this takes in a couple parameters. The first object that it takes in is your payload. So you can pass in, for example, a username the user role, like if they're an admin or not, or any other vital information you may want to be using the token for. I'm just going to pass in the username and make that equal to my user.username. The second thing we pass in is our config.server.token.secret. And then the third part, we're going to pass in some options. We're going to pass the issuer from our config.server.token.issuer. As far as algorithm goes, I'm just going to be using the standard HS256. Again, if you want to learn about all the different encrypting algorithms, you can go ahead and read the JSON Web Token documentation. And then expires in, I'm going to pass in my expire time in seconds. The JWT.sign function also has a callback. So we're going to be calling back our error and our token. So if there is an error, we're going to pass in our callback, make our error equal to error and our token equal to null. So when we call this from another function, that's how we know it's not going to be working properly if we get the error. Vice versa, else if token, we're going to be passing in a callback with our error equal to null and passing in our token. So inside the function using the callback, they'll know that the token was returned properly. And last but not least, in the catch block, you can go ahead and throw in a logging message there to catch your error. And also you can put the callback here, pass in the error and null as well. That way, if there is a problem even signing the token, you will get the error here. So this is all we need to do to set up everything that's common between whatever database that you're using. So this is the point in the video where we're actually going to diverge into whichever specific database this video is about. So if you've made it this far, we're going to be using MySQL as our database of choice. I'm going to be taking the first part of this and setting up some MySQL functions and MySQL configuration. If you're integrating this into a project where you already have MySQL integrated with something like SQLize, you can go ahead and skip to the part where I actually work on the controller. This part is just to set up for people that haven't done it before. I have set this up in previous videos, so I'm going to go through this relatively quickly. But that being said, if you do have any questions, please throw them in the comment section. And don't forget that you can look at the source code to see this all working together. So let's go ahead and install our MySQL packages. We're going to have to do an npm install MySQL, and then we're going to do an npm install -- save dev and install the MySQL types like we do for everything else TypeScript. Now, once we do that, you're going to go to your configuration file. So this is one I have set up from a previous video, but if you do have your own configuration file, you're going to need 4 variables. You're going to need a MySQL host, a MySQL username, a password, and a database. You're going to need these 4 basic parameters to connect to MySQL. So I'm going to speed this part up a little bit, but I am going to create these 4 variables here for the dummy database I've created locally. And then once you've created all that, create a MySQL object, add these 4 variables with the appropriate keys, as you'll see, and then attach that to your configuration object below. Once you've finished adding your MySQL configuration, I'm going to go ahead and create this MySQL file in my config folder, and this is going to hold my promise functions to connect to the database. Again, if you're using something like SQLize, you're not going to need this, but if you're doing your own MySQL work like I do, you're going to need to create some functions like this. So we're going to start at the top by importing MySQL from MySQL, and then we're going to go ahead and import config from config. Then we're going to create a const params object, and inside of it, we're going to have 4 keys: our user, password, host, and database, just like we created in our config file. You're going to pass in the key to each one from your config.mysql object. And then once that's finished, you have a parameters object you can now use to connect to your database. So in order to connect to MySQL, I like to use 2 functions. I like to create a promise function for the connection and then create a promise function for the query. So let's go ahead and create our connect promise function. We're going to do a const connect, and it's going to be an async function, and it's going to return a new promise, and that promise is going to be returning the type of a MySQL connection, so that the connection object you get in the resolve is of MySQL connection. And then you're going to add a callback with resolve and reject. You're going to create the connection using mysql.createConnection and then pass in your parameters. And then you're going to do a connection.connect with an error props as your callback. You're going to check to see if that error is there. If so, you're going to reject. And if there's no error, then you're going to resolve the connection. So that's all you need for the connect promise function. And then I like to do a query promise function. This one's going to be a little bit different because we're going to be passing in some extra parameters. So here we're going to do a const query is equal to an async function. You're going to add a T generic type. You're going to pass in the connection that is of a MySQL.connection. And you're going to be passing in a query of type string. That's going to create a new promise function. The promise is going to be of type T, which is the generic type from before. And then you're going to add your resolve and reject callbacks appropriately. How we're going to check to see if we're resolving or rejecting is we're going to do a connection.query. We're going to pass in our query, our connection, and then we're going to do an error and result callback. You're going to check the error much like you did in the connection, just checking to see if there is one. If so, reject the error and return. If not, you're going to go ahead and resolve the result. And there is a little bit extra housekeeping we're going to have to do here. After you resolve the result, you can go ahead and put a connection.end to close the MySQL connection, which is something you have to do each time you call the database. Once you've created these two functions, you can go ahead and just export these using an export statement and just passing in the connected query just as the key values themselves. Once we're finished with that, we have to do a little bit of interface housekeeping. So let's go to the iUser interface that we created before and just add an underscore ID that's a type number. This represents the primary key of the table that I've created. And obviously the table I've created has the columns underscore ID, number, and password. ID is an auto-incrementing primary key. Now there's one more interface I'm going to create to help clean up my functions a little bit. And we're going to be doing an export default interface of an iMySQL result. I'm just going to copy and paste it in here. What you're seeing here is an object that's returned every time we insert or update items in our database. MySQL is automatically going to return it in this format instead of returning the, let's say, the query that we're looking for, like rows of information. It's going to return this object anytime you use an insert or update. So I'm going to go ahead and create this, and I'm going to pass it in as my generic type anytime I'm inserting or updating. That way I know when I'm being returned. So that's about all the modifications and configuration we're going to need for MySQL. So we can now go ahead and go to the controller, much like we did for the Mongo video, and start inserting the functions appropriately. So at the top of the controller functions, I'm going to go ahead and import everything I need. I'm going to import my signed JWT function from the functions signed JWT file. I'm going to import my connect and query promise functions from my config MySQL. And I'm going to go ahead and import my iUser interface as well as that other MySQL interface that I created to help me with getting the proper returns from my promises. So let's go down to the register function that we have after our bcrypt.js hash, and let's go ahead and create a query. So this is just a standard SQL query that I'm creating to insert a user into the database. So I'm going to do an insert into users. Username and password are my columns, and then insert the values here using this format of string. And just so you know, you don't actually have to enter the ID because it's an auto-incrementing primary key, so it just gets created for you if you set it up that way. Then I'm going to call my connect function, and I'm going to add a then block and a catch block. The then block is going to resolve the MySQL connection. I'm going to call it connection, and the catch block will resolve an error. Inside of the catch block, let's just go ahead and set that up. I'm just going to make a little logging function here. Again, my logging.error is using a logging library I created, so this is the format of the string I'm putting in. And we're going to return a response.status of 500 with a JSON giving us the message and the error itself. Now, inside, I'm going to call my query, pass in my iMySQL result interface because I know I'm inserting or updating. I'm going to pass in the connection and the query. I'm going to get my result prop from my then block, and I'm going to insert a catch block that has an error prop as well. I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste the error block from before. Now you'll see here that I have a little error, and that's because inside of my promise functions, I didn't actually return the promise. It's returning a function with a promise inside. So I actually wanted these functions to return the type of promise. So I just need to get rid of these brackets that are outside of my new promise function and have the functions return the promise directly. So once you get rid of the brackets like this, now these functions are returning promises. And when you're using them with the then catch blocks, all the variables are returning properly now. So inside of the then block, I'm going to go ahead and log that result.insertID with just a little message saying user with ID inserted, and return a response.status of 201 and just return the actual result itself. Now let's go to the login function, and first let's parse the body with a let username and password be equal to our request.body, and let's create another query. This one's going to be a little bit easier as we're just selecting from users where the username is equal to the username of the body. I'm going to go to the previous function and copy our connect and query blocks and insert them here. So instead of having the MySQL result, what we're going to be returning here is actually an array of rows of users. So we already have that defined as the iUser. So inside of the generic type, let's go ahead and make that an iUser array. Now inside of the then block in the query, this is where we're going to want to actually check the password when we're logging in. So we're going to do a bcryptjs.compare the password with the first user in the array. And let's go ahead and change that result name to users just so we understand it a little bit better. We're going to use our users at index of 0 password, and we're going to be doing an error result callback. Remember that we're not doing any error checking here to see if we have multiple users with that name. So please, inside of your APIs, make sure you're only getting one user inside of this array, or there is some sort of error with your database. So inside of our callback, let's check for an error. If there is an error, we can just go ahead and return a status here 401, or again, if you wanted to keep your API a little more secure, you could do a 500 just so people trying to hack your database don't actually know what the problem is. But we're just doing this for testing purposes, so let's just go ahead and return the message and the error. If there's no error, let's go ahead and check the result. And we're going to go ahead and try and sign JWT. So we're going to call this function we created before. We're going to pass in our user, and we're going to pass in an error and token callback function. If there's an error, let's just copy and paste this from above and just modify our error message saying that we were unable to sign the JWT, pass in the error as well. And then we can go ahead and check our else if the token exists, we can return to the user a little message that says, hey, you know what, you're authorized, and then go ahead and return the token to the user. And you can actually return the user as well if you want, if your front end needs to make use of any of the user's information. Once this is done, let's go down to the getAllUsers function, and we can go ahead and create one more query. This one is just going to select all the users from the database, but when we do that, we only want to select the ID and username. We don't actually want to return the password, and we're going to be selecting that from users. You can go ahead and copy and paste the function we just created, starting from the connect block, and instead of doing the bcrypt hash and all of that stuff on the inside, you can get rid of all of that, and we're just going to be returning a response.status of 200, and it's going to have some JSON in it. You could just pass in the users, and you can pass in the count by using the users.length. And now that we're finished all of this, it's time to actually test out our database. So let's go ahead, and I'm going to open up Postmon. You can go ahead and open up any testing utility you want to use, and let's start playing around with our routes. So I'm going to go ahead and start my server by doing a ts-node-dev, my source server file, wait for my server to start running, and then I'm going to bring up my Postmon utility. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to run this users get all route, and you'll see that no users are returned, but that does mean that the connection to the database is working properly. So I'm going to go ahead and make a post request here. And if you take a look at the body, I have a username and password of Bob and hello123. I'm going to go ahead and hit the register route with this and see if I can create a user. And my user's inserted successfully, and you'll see that the object returned is that MySQL result that I showed you earlier that we made the interface for. So before I log in this user, I have to add one more thing to our routes file, and that's actually protecting our validate route with the extract JWT middleware. So let's go to the user routes here. Let's import our extract JWT. And when we put this after these /validate and before the controller validate token, it's going to have to run the request through this middleware first, so that if we do have a token, that's good, we'll be authorized. But if we don't have a token or we have a bad token, it's going to boot us out and not let us get to that controller function. So now that I have it, let's save it and restart. And now I'm going to go ahead and hit the login, which should return me a token. And we can see the tokens returned to me here. I'm going to go ahead and copy that. And then I'm going to go and try and hit the validate route. And all I have to do is add a header with the authorization key. And when I hit this without it, you're going to see that I'm unauthorized, so it does boot me out. So let's put in my authorization key. And inside of the value section, I'm going to put the word bearer with a capital B, space, and then paste my token because this is a bearer token. And I'm going to hit send. And now you'll see that I'm authorized. So again, without this token, you're not going to be able to hit protected routes. And if you want to do something with user control, such as administration, moderation, you can add that kind of information into the token. And then when the server receives the token, instead of finding that user in the database, maybe it can quickly decipher it from the token. Or if you wanted to control all that stuff on the server side, that's totally up to you as well. Well, there you have it, guys. That's 2 videos, one with MySQL, one with Mongo, showing you how to use JSON Web Tokens with both. I hope you enjoyed these videos. If there's anything else you want to see in the future, please let me know. And I look forward to seeing you in the next one.